Hello, my internet friends. Still imaginary, I believe. So, today I want to talk about comedians and stand-up comedy. As I said on the first episode, whatever it is, of this podcast, I got inspired by Bill Burr, who is a comedian, pretty famous comedian in America. And I think he's had his podcast now for, 10 years, I believe. I found out about it just randomly, I think this year or last year. And it's just hilarious because, I like the fact that at this time in age, we actually don't have celebrities anymore. I mean, we still have VIPs and celebrities, but they're just so ridiculous now that it's just anybody who has like two fucking neurons to put together doesn't give a shit about them. But other types of people that in the past, we would consider like celebrities, like untouchable, pristine people. Now, thanks to these, new types of communication and that these celebrities have, you don't just see them in movie theaters or in theaters. You can hear a famous person just talk about their day and have a podcast where they just talk about normal shit. And you realize that they're just normal people. They're not, even the best, most famous, like, I don't know, like right now, probably the most celebrity comedian that there is out there is Kevin Hart, as far as I can imagine. Most people would say Dave Chappelle, but like Kevin Hart makes 5 times the amount of money and audience that Dave Chappelle makes. And he's probably the one that has blew up the most in the last few years, as far as I can tell. So I don't know if there's any other mainstream, like, internet comedians, like, I don't know, stand-up comedians that just turned into comedy influencers or some shit like that. I don't care about those. I'm talking about actual stand-up comedians. So even him, it's like you can definitely find some podcast, something where he just talks about his life. And, it's not just, let's look up on TMZ what Kevin Hart is doing. No, you can just look up a Joe Rogan podcast where he's talking for 2.5 hours about his life, his family, his dreams, his childhood, whatever. And it's not like a perfectly crafted interview, like it's scripted thing. It's just him talking. And I like that about celebrities and just artists in general, when you can just, you can realize that they're just people, that they made it because they had consistency and they had a dream, and they have talent, of course, and they worked hard, and they were lucky, and now they're in this position and they're happy about it, hopefully. So they can share stuff, and it's interesting. Most people don't make it. That's just the reality of it. And for a long time in show business, that wasn't the reality. Like, they were telling us that, anybody can make it. You just have to do this, this, and that. That's bullshit. That never happened, and that is never going to happen, because just look around you. Whatever you are right now, look around you and tell me how many people you think made it in life. How many people you think are doing the thing that makes them happy every day of their life? Because making it is not just about money. I don't give a shit about money. It's about finding the thing that you love in life and do that, and never have to work a day in your life, and be happy and be at peace with yourself. And sometimes that comes with a lot of money, and that definitely helps. I'm sure Kevin Hart, is happy now. And I'm sure the millions of dollars that he's making fucking help in, making his life way fucking easier. But that wasn't always the way. you know? So I understand giving shit to people that are born into wealth, but most comedians, I'd say probably all comedians, at least all the ones that are funny, they're not, because comedy, ironically, comedy comes from desperation. Comedy comes from sadness, comes from grief, it comes from depression, and these people, they just have a quality in them, whether it's family acquired, whether the environment that they grew up in made them so that they can look at the world in a different way. And everybody has their own way of expressing this view, and everybody has their favorite topics to talk about. Some people express it with observational comedy, some people express it with sarcasm, some people express it with satire, some people express it with very dark nonsense humor, and some comedians, they just do like a mix of all of those. Some of them sing, some of them, so there's many ways of expressing it, but they all have in common this thing of looking at the world through like this ironic lens. And that takes a lot of guts, because when you're depressed, when some shit happens to you, it takes, you're either just lucky that you're just born that way and you never, like, even in bad times, you just automatically just find it funny for some reason. And that's probably environmental. It depends on the family that you grew up with. Like, I'm thinking of Ricky Gervais. He always talks, and he talked about it on the show. He had a great bit, I think it was the closing bit of one of his shows, where he talks about his brother, and they were at the funeral of their mother, I think. And he talks about this just funny thing that his brother came up with to make the priest say in church, like, to misspell one of his brother's names, and everybody would just have a laugh. And that's the kind of environment that he grew up in, and that's most comedians, really. They grow up in, like, let's take another example, like Dave Chappelle. He didn't grow up in the, he jokes about this all the time, saying that, like, I didn't grow up in the projects, I didn't grow up in the hood, or in the ghetto. Like, I went to arts college, liberal arts college, and from what I understand, his mother and grandmother, like, they were really, I think they were teachers or something like that. But they're really literate people. So he grew up in a very cultural environment, cultural rich environment. So, but even with that, he was able to take to joke and make comedy about issues that maybe he didn't really experienced. I don't know. He definitely did. He was he's a black man. He grew up in the 70s and 80s. I'm sure most of the stuff that he jokes about on that particular topic actually happened to him. But like, you couldn't tell, at first. Now you can tell, because he's more open and the crowd knows him, and he's talking about more deep topics. But at first you couldn't tell. You just, he's just another black comedian. Like, he grew up poor around black kids and he's doing black versus white comedy, blah blah blah. But it's like, that's not the case. He had to grow up in a creative, and in his case, culturally rich environment. Some other comedians, they grow up in the hood, in a very ignorant environment, and that makes it funny as well. And they find the comedy in that too, and they have a totally different style. But they all have in common this thing. They can just observe the world around them, whatever that might be, and just make it funny. Like, another example, Robin Williams. He was incredibly funny because he lacked the attention from most of his childhood and adolescence. Like, I remember reading his biography, and he was very attached to his mother, I think. So like his comedy came from a and we all know how his life ended. So his comedy came from a very, very sad uh, environment that he had to live in, and he was very introvert, and you wouldn't tell, right? But his jokes and his comedy was like his pain was so big that he made a whole fucking career making people laugh to be accepted and to try to fill that void and to try to stop that pain, And he sniffed cocaine and was alcoholic for a while. And that obviously tells you, how big this fucking pain was that he was living through. But some people fucking they just kill themselves straight away, or they just have depression and they stay on drugs for years and years, and they have a shitty life. And he was able, in spite of that, he was able to make a fucking great career out of it. And it's still because he went to college, he studied theater, he recited in Shakespearean plays, so he had an actual background and an actual passion with that. But as he said in an interview, like the Inside the Actor Studio interview, like he thinks it's kind of genetic, or it's like 50-50. Like you have to be born with something that just makes you that way. And because again, there are some people who have the same issues that he had, but they couldn't be funny, no matter how much you pay them or you beg them. They just can't, because they can't find the humor in anything. They're so depressed. He was depressed. He lacked, but this kind of depression and lack of acceptance, his brain was just like, hey, let's do something funny and see how that works. You do something funny, people laugh, they like you. There you go. Your brain tells you that you solved the problem. So you keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and it becomes like a drug. And at a certain point in his career, it just wasn't enough anymore. So he was like, wait, this is not actually solving my problem. So I have to do something to make people even laugh even more. What can I do to enhance my comedy? Let's do some drugs. Everybody's doing it. Everybody in the business is telling me that it helps you, and it's amazing. So let's do some drugs. And he got on stage and he probably thought that he was funnier that way and that the laughs were bigger. So that, that kind of tells you that you never solve problems this way, even though an incredibly comedic genius came out of it, an incredible actor as well. So he was a professional too. It's not enough, and it's not solving the issue. You're just coping with it, but you're not solving it. And he never did. And that's why, unfortunately, he killed himself. So there's all these, stand-up comedians are just so interesting to me because they're just people. Like they're not celebrities. And the stand-up comedians that become celebrities, like, I don't give a fuck about them. Even Kevin Hart, he's a great guy. He's funny. I love his comedy, but his comedy is like TV comedy. Like, I don't know. He's big. He's very big, and it's like, oh, you're just jealous. No, I'm fucking happy for him. But it's like, it's not the type. I like the comedy like that comes from some kind of dark place, because that kind of tells you the truth. So Kevin Hart is good. It's like, oh, let's just watch this with my family and have a laugh for an hour, right? And that's totally fine. That's comedy as well. But it's another style. When I talk about stand-up comedians, I talk about like, I guess the more serious ones. And you're like, well, Robin Williams wasn't serious. Well, he was some people don't really like Robin Williams as a stand-up comedian, and I understand why, because he was very repetitive. Over the years, because now we young people, we have YouTube. I can watch all of Robin Williams' stand-up material in like a day, right? But throughout the years, you can see that, he had kind of repetitive behaviors on stage and kind of repetitive jokes. But it's like, it's a fucking decades in that career. Not everybody can just make a new thing every day. He loved improv, and when you do improv, it's not always improv. You're always, if something worked in the past, that just stays with you, and the next time you do improv, you think about it and you just do it. You don't really plan it, because you've always got a laugh for it. So why wouldn't you just keep doing it? So people that know Robin Williams and they watch his interviews and his stand-up comedy, they know what I'm talking about. But even then, he was able to to talk about real issues in his own way, in his own style. Maybe not really in a cynical way like a George Carlin or a Dave Chappelle would. Always trying to find a really funny, like humoristic, clowny kind of way of looking at it. But he still talked about serious stuff. When I think about Kevin Hart, and I'm sorry I'm just picking on Kevin Hart, it's just the first guy that comes into mind. He's more of a mainstream comedian. Like, he talks about stuff that comedians talk about. He doesn't really talk about issues. He talks about himself a lot. And I guess he draws his comedy from that. Now the last few years he's talked about, I don't know, his family, his wife and kids, and things, his buddies and stuff like that. So he's more of a self-involved comedian. And like Bill Burr is another one of those. But I respect him and I like him a lot because he talks about himself, usually. Yeah, he doesn't, he talks about the overpopulation stuff and the gold-digging horse and stuff like that. So kind of, actual problems, but the main topics of Bill Burr are two, like women, because, every show that you see, he talks about women, at least like 50% of the show is just something about women. And that's good because he knows a lot about them, about women. He's learned a lot about women, so why wouldn't you joke about it? And himself, just, how his childhood and his rage and how he's overcome that. So that's the main topics that he talks about. And now, like, his relationship with his wife and stuff like that. But, for example, he doesn't talk about his kids. He has children. He made specials on Netflix very recently. As far as I can recall, he doesn't talk about his children. Some people will be like, oh, I have a 3-year-old, they do this, they do that. He doesn't talk about it. So, but he talks about his wife constantly, Nia. She's on the podcast. See, this is another great thing. Like, now I know all of those shows, even because they've been together for now, I think it's like 15 years. So when you see shows, like early shows of Bill Burr, stand-up specials, he talks about his girlfriend, and you know who she is now because you can just listen to her on the podcast, and you're like, oh, these two, you hear them on the podcast, they fight, they talk, they discuss, they say things to each other, and you can listen to them for hours and hours. So then when you actually listen to, where he's coming from. Oh, I see how he got to that joke because it's Nia, and, I see how they interact with each other. So it's actually, it makes it real, which makes it even funnier. So he's like, Kevin Hart in the sense that he talks about himself mainly and his own experiences. He doesn't really talk about the world's problems. Except, again, for maybe a couple of kind of conspiracy-like bits. But he's mostly, he mostly talks about himself. Yes, recently he addressed, the woke culture in his own way. Yeah. So he's grown as a comedian. That's why I like him a lot. You can see he's kept some of the same behavior and traits from the beginning, like the rage thing, even though he's actually, as a person, and you can see this from the podcast when he talks about himself, as a person, he's grown a lot, and he's understood a lot of things with the birth of, with his wife and getting married and having kids, like made him realize a lot of shit about himself. But on stage, he's still the rage guy, the angry guy, or like the what the fuck guy. He's more about complaining than rage. Like a rage comedian is like Louis Black, where he actually acts like he's fucking mad on stage. But Bill Burr, he's like, I don't know, he's a character. Like, we all know that guy. I am that guy. Like, I like Bill Burr because I really see myself in him, in that I'm always the guy that fucking complains. I'm always the guy that talks about, like, why is nobody fucking talking about this? And I kind of, I try to point out, like, the absurdity in some things. And I'm also, like, I don't want to say I'm into conspiracies. I'm into that shit too. Like, he talks about the banks and the bankers and stuff like that. Or like, when he goes to the fucking grocery store and there's a lady being like, can we have your phone number? It's like, no, you can't have it because you're fucking up to something. Why you're just collecting numbers? You're doing something. You're just picking up shit. You're trying to track my behavior so that, you're trying to pump the price of the stuff that I like. Stuff like, so I really think like that. I always I overanalyze shit. And I try to find the reason behind it because, I kind of grew up in the same, even though we're totally two different people from two different countries, but like, I can understand the environment he grew up in because he talks about it all the time. Like his parents always fighting and this like very hardcore, no feelings, raw Boston, like just push down your feelings. You're a fucking man. Shut the fuck up and sit down. And it's like, I kind of, I didn't grow up with that exactly, but I did grow up with, a very old, stylish kind of father. I got some beatings, of course, like everybody. And it's like, now that I'm an adult, I'm like, you know what? I think my parents were wrong. They shouldn't have, well, my father, because my mother, like mothers, Italian mothers, they never get angry, but when they do, that fucking ring on your mouth or your head fucking hurts. But when your mother gets angry, you feel sorry. And it's also funny. Like when our mother got angry, when we were kids, we were like, oh, fuck you. But we also felt sorry. When we got a little bit bigger, me and my brother, well, my sister, she never got beaten because she was, she's the fucking princess of the house. But me and my brother, when we got bigger and our mother would try to hit us, we were like, okay, fine, we get it. Okay, you're angry. Okay, we're gonna stop. Fine. Oh, look out. That's the way we were. But when my dad gets angry, it's like, oh shit. Okay, let's all be serious now. Because this guy's fucking crazy. This guy is fucking nuts. Something wrong with it. And he would tell us, like, I'm fucking crazy. Don't you fucking play with me. That's his move, And now I know, like, as an adult, the way he grew up, he's a Sicilian, okay? So he grew up in that kind of environment in the 70s. If you know anything about history and the mafia and Italian, the 70s and 80s, they were not a really nice time in Sicily. So you had to be kind of a tough kid. So he has that kind of moves of like, don't fucking, I'm calm and everything, but if you do this shit, I fucking go nuts. I don't care if you're my son. I'll fucking beat the shit out of you. But at the end of the day, he, like, most of the times he wouldn't. He would just yell, and sometimes he would just, spanking and stuff like that, but not as often as many other cases. But that was enough to keep us mostly in line and afraid. And that's the same behavior. But Bill grew up in an environment that was always angry. And I kind of did too. Like, there was always family issues and complaining. you go to your aunt's house and you're a kid, so you're like, oh, I'm at my aunt's and my uncle's house. I'm with my cousins. I'm playing video games, and it's happy. It's a happy time. And then we get on the ride, on the car, the ride back home. Like my parents would just complain about them and just talk shit about them, or just talk about financial problems and stuff. And I'd be like, why? What is happening? Why are they not happy? I was happy to see my cousin. Well, whatever. I'm just not going to listen to this. So I grew up like with those subliminal things in my childhood of like, there's always some issues, and like somebody's always trying to fuck you over. So I kind of understand where Bill comes from, and in his case, it was mostly anger. So people fighting, and because I guess they don't really have that kind of family culture. They had that family culture in the 70s where you have the thing about keeping your feelings down, but like in Boston, they also have the thing about just yelling shit and just, telling it how it is. In my case, it was most like, oh, just put a face on, put a mask on. This used to have a different meaning, kids, when I was younger, putting a mask on. This is a metaphor. So put a mask on, put a nice face on, but there's always some issues going on. So we have to put a nice face, but there's gonna be like, just hide the problems, never solve them, and they're just gonna come up later and blow up in your face. Doesn't matter. You're just gonna face them whenever they happen. So this is the kind of environment I grew up in, so I can kind of relate to Bill's comedy when he talks about that. I know I've listened, as I said in my English self-taught English video. I started listening to stand-up comedy when I was in high school, 14, 15, and the first guys that I saw were, the first one was Bill Cosby, because the Cosby Show was very, very famous all around the world, as you know, and I grew up watching it because it was the most, I think it's the most played show, like the most replicated show of all time. Like it started in the 80s. My mom was a fucking teenager when that show came out, and when I was a kid, I was still watching that show in the 2000s. They were just doing it on television, so I grew up watching it. And I was like, Bill Cosby did stand-up comedy? Oh my God, because I thought he just did the Cosby Show, because I never saw him. I've never seen him anywhere else. So I started looking up stuff on YouTube about him, and I was like, oh, he used to do stand-up comedy, and I found some old footage of the 60s where he did stand-up comedy, and then I saw that he did all these albums and stuff, and then I found a show of 1983, one of the two shows that he did before his last show when he was old, like in 2000, whatever, 10. He did two shows, one in 1983, I don't remember the name, but it was big time, Bill Cosby Show era. And then another one in the 90s. No, I think it was still the 80s, like late 80s, maybe, early 90s, which was called 49. He was 49 years old. So yeah, I guess it was the late 80s, which was funny as hell. And I actually translated the whole show. It was an hour and 30 minutes, something like that. The first show, I translated it. I put subtitles on it, Italian subtitles, just as an exercise, because I just wanted to learn. I wanted to know exactly what he was saying throughout the whole show so I could enjoy it. And I was like, in the meantime, I'm just going to put subtitles on because I want other people to know about this, because in Italy, stand-up comedy is just coming up, as I said before. It's just coming up. Stand-up comedians, this whole concept of just one guy going on stage for 5 minutes and saying some jokes and getting off, it never happened before. This is a very recent thing. So when I was a teenager, which was like 10 years ago, it was still a very niche thing. There were just a few people translating some videos on the internet, nobody gave a shit about it, and nobody knew about it. You know, we were still in the TV comedy stage here in Italy, and movie comedy and stuff like that. So I did it because I was like, fuck, everybody has to see this because it's Bill Cosby, so I'll just put it on YouTube. And I did that. So that was my first exposure. And then I started getting into stand-up comedy in general. And the two main guys that I found out about were George Carlin and Bill Hicks. And I think everybody can relate to this, especially younger people who just found out about stand-up comedy just looking on YouTube. I mean, also Lenny Bruce, Richard Pryor, but it's like Lenny Bruce was very old footage. So at first I didn't really like it. I didn't really appreciate it. And Richard Pryor, my English was not that good to understand like African American spoken English. And the more I listened to it, the more, you know, I was able to understand it. But that kind of cadence and accent, it was just too quick for me, and too many slang words. So I was laughing, but I was still not really appreciating. Eddie Murphy, of course, because he was another guy that it's like I just saw him in the movies. Eddie Murphy, Jim Carrey, he had a special in the 80s, or the 90s, I think. Yeah. No, the 80s, before he did Living Color. So first I found out about all the famous guys. So Bill Cosby, Eddie Murphy, Jim Carrey, all these people that actually did stand-up comedy, and I didn't know about it because I only knew them from TV shows or movies. And then I actually got into stand-up comedy. And George Carlin actually fucking helped me a lot, just understanding how this fucking culture works. And especially the bit about religion. So he had a very, very special way of looking at things. Well, not special, just very cynical and very realistic. And he was able to just construct sentences and whole bits perfectly, where you can just, it was just like he was just writing a book. And everybody, you know, he's the frame of reference, because everybody, when you see a new comedian or a comedian that tells some true shit on stage, everybody's like, oh, this is the next George Carlin. This is the next George Carlin. Because he's just the frame of reference, because he was such a professional. Because George, he came out of the radio, television business. You know, he used to do like very uptight tuxedo kind of comedy. You know, still like 50s and 60s type of comedy of like, you know, jazzy music in the background and stuff like that. And then when the whole revolution, the hippie revolution happened, he just changed his whole game because he realized how fucked up the system actually is. And he slowly paved his way into like celebrity-like level while telling everybody to just go fuck themselves, and becoming grumpier and grumpier and more cynical and realistic every year. But he also had a tenderness, I think, to him, because he was, at the end of the day, he was sorry. Like, he was sorry that this was happening, because he loved America, he loved his art. He knew that people individually taken are very special. You know, each one of them is unique. But when you take everyone as a group, when you take society, when you take all this rigged game, it just sucks so bad that eventually he had to take himself out of it and just look at it like an outsider and be like, I just can't be part of this shit anymore. Which made his whole act way funnier. And the problem is, people only thought it was funny. They didn't think that, you know, I mean, they knew he was telling the truth, but when you say it in a comedic setting, people just think it's comedy. And in one way it was art, it was his art, and he was a professional, and he loved writing. He loved what he did. He didn't just do it just because he wanted to complain or just because he wanted to send a message. He just did it because that was his craft, and he was amazing at it, and he loved it. And and he was a very intellectual person. But again, when he was performing, when he was talking about groups of people or society or politics or whatever, he just, he had one for everybody. And only somebody that can actually be an outsider and look at things that way can really, really have a joke for anything. But yeah, with him, I really appreciated just the importance that he gave to language and how he used it, literally like a tool. Because he did use some moves on stage, he made some faces, especially in the beginning. So he was able to make a lot of faces, a lot of voices, more than people give him credit for. He was a very mimical comedian as well. He wasn't just standing still, just talking, like David Chappelle would, just standing there, just talking and just being himself. He was a real actor, I think, and he loved to act as well. He didn't act as much as he wanted, as far as I know. So he was really good at that too. That was a very important part of his act. Whereas on the other side, Bill Hicks really inspired me to just look at the world. I mean, he didn't inspire me because I'm a fucking realistic, cynical piece of shit. I'm not spiritual in any way, but I used to be in my teenage years, and I always have that in the back of my head. Thanks to him. Talking about drugs, hallucinogenic drugs, spiritualism, looking at the world like it's just a ride. That also, Bill came from a place that was less harsh. Like George Carlin, he came from New York. He was harsh. He was like, fuck everybody. This is what I think. Fuck you. Like more of that tone. Whereas Bill, he actually felt, I think, the pain of what he was talking about. He sounded cynical sometimes, but he wasn't. I think he was a very sweet person and a very soft, not soft, just emotional man. And you can see that there's a very famous episode of a heckler, a female cunt, again with the C word. Well, that's what he called her anyway. And she was just drunk, and he was doing a bit, and it was very late in his career. It was probably 92, 93, so just a couple of years before he passed away. I'm sorry, before he died. I'm sorry, George. This is a reference to a bit of George Carlin. So this woman just interrupted him, and he just went on this rant that was so amazing, but at the same time it was so heartbreaking, of like he was just trying to express himself on stage. And the fact that this fucking bitch was just into herself so much that she didn't even realize that. She didn't care. She just wanted to just spit out some shit out of her fucking mouth. And he got so angry and so pissed and so frustrated. You can see that there was a lot of frustration in that rant, like a lot of built up frustration. Like, I've been doing this for years, and I think it's all been wasted on these people. That was the kind of feeling, like he was actually trying to send a message, like George Carlin wasn't. He was trying to send a message, love, peace. There's a very famous speech about, life is just like a ride. And at the end is like, let's take all he had a very, from a political standpoint, you would say he had a very, I don't know, socialist point of view. I don't fucking care. But he was like, let's take all the money that we spend on guns and war every year and use them to feed and to clothe and to cure and to feed the poor of the world so we can live in a better world all together, blah, blah, blah. And it was a very peaceful, loving message. And it came from a peaceful, loving person. So that really stuck with me. And And he was also a comedic talent. Like he started comedy when he was like 14, 15. He started just performing in clubs, very dirty clubs in front of adults. I think strip clubs and stuff like that. He was a fucking teenager in Houston. Houston, I think he was from. Well, Texas anyway. It was either Houston or Dallas. I don't remember. And he was inspired, I think, mostly by Lenny Bruce. I think, but he was, he was one of those kids. Like I think he was the Mike Tyson of comedy, because like he just had this talent, and he was more professional than he would look. I think he would study very closely, especially. I think he said this in an interview. He would study very closely all the comedians and stuff and watch their tapes all the time and just learn about it, and then he would just go on stage and do his own thing. Yeah, I don't know if the Mike Tyson comparison is right, but whatever. I'm a fucking idiot. Yeah, so he was really, really good, I think. Yeah, he had his own style. I've never seen anybody perform like him. Just have the same energy that he had on stage. He would just, he would capture the stage completely. So he had this energy about him that I never really seen with any other comedian. And he just had it. It wasn't because of, he was a celebrity, because he wasn't. I don't think he got to that stage right before he died. Like he went on Letterman and stuff like that, but he just did like a couple specials, I think, or one HBO special, the main one. And then all other videos that you can find of him is him performing in clubs. So he was a very underground comedian. And he probably got famous mostly because of his death. I don't know if that's the case, but I think he got really famous after he died. And that's great, because that's just like the heroes that he loved, like Jimi Hendrix, all those people that he always talked about, just like the burning flames, like he was just there for a few years, and he gave it his all, and he gave us enough. So kind of like Jimi Hendrix, all those talented, very energetic, just souls that in a matter of a few years just gave it their all, and they didn't really have any reason to just keep going. And he died of cancer. So it was kind of like, it's nature or God's way of being like, you did your job, you're good to go. You understood what life is about. You tried to send the message to people. You had fun. So it's time to go. That's the way that I see it from a spiritual standpoint. Because when you hear Bill's act and words, it's enough. It's enough to understand. He didn't need to say any more of that. So that's the way I see him. I see him more like this spiritual sense. These are the two main pillars. And then I just found out about a shit ton of comedians, British comedians as well. I love Ricky Gervais, Eddie Izzard, Jimmy Carr is an awesome one-liner. Another American comedian that I love, kind of an underground comedian, is talking about one-liners, is Mitch Hedberg, another man who died very young. Yeah, he's just a guy. You can see that, he was a master at doing, one-line jokes, but you could see that he was just enjoying himself on stage. Now, I don't recall the history. I think he did drugs. I think. Of course he did. Who the fuck didn't do drugs in those years? But he was just so chill and so just having fun doing that. I don't really know, again, I haven't gone in depth on the character, on the person, but I like him a lot. And of course, Richard Pryor, he was very good. He was a character as well. He was like a... I think Richard was to comedy what... No, I was going to compare him to Elvis, but I think Lenny Bruce is more comparable to Elvis, because Lenny was just the first guy who said, fuck it. I'm just gonna go against everything, all the odds, and I'm just gonna say whatever they don't want me to say, and I'm gonna fuck up, and I'm gonna get arrested, and I'm gonna, he went through all of that, but I think Richard Pryor is more like Elvis, because Richard got more abused by the industry, I think, than Lenny. Lenny wasn't really into the industry, as far as I recall, but it was a very disruptive. Like none of the stuff that we have today would be possible without Lenny, and I'm sure somebody else would have come up sooner or later, but he did, and he just paved the way for everybody else. But I don't really know a lot of his stuff. I just watched the famous stuff. I watched the movie, I think, a few years ago with Dustin Hoffman. But yeah, those were really hard times to be a controversial comedian. It's not like now it's like, oh, trans people, and it's like you're controversial. It's like, going on stage and saying nigger, Guinea, or whatever other insult. Yeah, is it Guinea? Whatever insult for Italians, I don't give a fuck. I don't understand. I'm gonna go into complain mode a little bit. I don't really understand what the fuck is it with 20-year-old African American who complain about the words like nigger and stuff like that. What the fuck do you have to do with nigger slaves? What the hell do you have to do with them? Nothing. So why the fuck are you complaining? I can understand in the 60s, it's like, oh, my grandfather was fucking a slave, it was a slave for your grandfather. So don't fucking call me a nigger. Like, I can understand that, but now it's like it's been so long and there's been so many generations. Like, bitch, you have the same fucking privileges that I do as a 20-year-old, 20-something-year-old. You got your smartphone, you got your internet, you got your fucking iPods, whatever, smart things, You have a house, you got a roof, you got food, you got fast food, you got cheap stuff, you can work, you can do the same shitty 20-year-old jobs that I can do as a white guy. What the fuck are you complaining about? Words? You can use the word nigga with your friends, but, if you somebody say nigger, it's like, oh my God, my ancestors. It's like, you don't give a fuck. You're just doing it for social recognition at this point. It doesn't have anything to do with history. It doesn't have anything to do with anything practical. We're all fucking slaves now. Are you happy? Okay? We're all fucked up. We're all being fucked up. There's no difference anymore. This is the equality that they wanted. They wanted all of us to be poor slaves. And now we are. So I don't really understand the words, the issue. But when you talk about Lenny Bruce going on stage and saying that, it was like, oh shit, like he was saying what everybody else knew. He just brought it to the stage because everybody was just pretending, black people were pretending that they weren't slaves and they were actually free, just because they were like, fuck it, they're giving us a little bit of freedom. Let's not make them mad. So let's pretend that we're happy, doing blackface and all that shit. Right? And white people were just like, oh, we're actually better than our ancestors right now. You're not. So he just brought it to the stage. Like, we're all just hypocrites. That's what we are. We're just pretending. So we're just we're censoring all these words and stuff. Why? Because that's real. Because that's a reality. Like, you, sir, you're a nigger. That's what people call you outside of this business, outside of television. People look at you and they say you're a nigger. Okay? And people look at you and they say you're a beaner, whatever, for Mexicans, something about beans. I don't know. So I know about that bit, and that was really fucking, like, that was an historic moment. That was like a Cassius Clay changing his name to Muhammad Ali kind of moment, I think, in the whole culture and society. And yeah, that's what I think of Lenny. He just paved the way. And yeah, I think this was enough. I love stand-up comedy, and there's a ton of shit that I love to talk about. From the technical things of how a joke is constructed. And there's another one. This is the last one. Louis C.K. I think he inherited George Carlin's talent and professionalism. Not his. He inherited George Carlin's professionalism best because he's not trying to be him. He's trying to he's applying the same ethic, the same work ethic that George did. Because Louis, he loves writing, as we know. He wrote for a shit ton of movies, and he wrote his own TV shows. He's very good at that, at writing comedy. And he, as we know, he throws away his old act. Every time he does one, he just throws away everything and he starts from scratch. And that is a really brave thing to do as a comedian, because when you got like an hour material that works and that is super funny, and it's very hard to be like, oh, let me just do everything from scratch. Like, I'm on the next show or my next TV show, my next special, whatever, I'm not going to use all these jokes that I know are going to work. Because you guys see shows of but comedians actually do like 50, 100 shows, every time they do, and then they tape one special, but it's like they go around around the world or around America. They do a shit ton of shows, so they could easily just use the same jokes and they would have a different crowd every time, and not everybody knows all of their jokes. So they would still be, funny out there, but he loves his craft so much that he just loves writing, and he loves coming up with new stuff, because he knows that's what keeps you going. That's what keeps you creative. That's what keeps, that's how you can create new and interesting and funny stuff throughout time. And he loved George Carlin, and I think he inherited a lot of the same work ethic that George had. Even though the material is very different and the style is very different, I think he's the more similar one to George. He's really good at studying the jokes, and he's really good at making it look like he didn't really prepare the jokes, but he did. Whatever you see Louis C.K. doing on stage, he planned it. He knows exactly what he's going to say. He knows the pauses. He knows everything. He just like George. George went on stage. He just did his act. George were more straightforward. Like, it was a theater play. It was like, I'm not going to interact with you, the crowd. I'm just going to do my own thing. I have my own bits. I have my own timing, and I'm just going to do it and then get out. That's it. It was more like a theater play. Louis his style makes it look like he's just on stage bringing up shit and talking about stuff. And sometimes it looks like he just came up with something, so he talks about it, but that's totally planned. He never improvises. That's totally planned. And as you know, Louis C.K. is another comedian, just like George, who doesn't interact with the crowd. When you take, for example, Bill Burr, Dave Chappelle, another comedian that, comedians that are modern, they sometimes interact with the crowd. They interact with the hecklers. So they talk to the crowd, because they talk about issues that the crowd can relate to. But Louis C.K., George Carlin, all these ones, they just have their own work, and they just want to show it. And Ricky Gervais, for example, he's another one. He's great at writing. He wrote The Office, of course. He just goes out there and he just shows the crowd what he's got. He doesn't want to interact with the crowd. He just wants to show the crowd what he's got. And so these are two different types of comedians, and I love both types, of course. So, this is the end of it. I hope this was interesting to anybody listening. And please, that's it, please. No, just share whatever you feel like sharing about stand-up comedy. I probably heard about it. So, you know, any comedians listening? Yeah. You probably are not. Yeah. Well, I mean, who the fuck is listening anyway? Whatever. I'm gonna depress myself now. Just kidding. I'm gonna go back to work. So, thank you for listening, everyone. Bye.